But I said, I really appreciate the way you opened up your prayer. And he said, well, I was just being honest. And he said, God, we come to you with all our mess. That's it. I mean, we're at a barbecue, just hanging out, 4th of July, you know? But like, that's where he is with God. And he's also about 70. I love hanging out with 70-year-olds because there's so much wisdom to glean from them. Let me just move on to the third one, which is loving God with all our heart, right? Loving God with all our heart, right? And just the one point that I would like for us to get here is that I believe God wants us to see him as his friend. That's how we're going to love God with all our heart. Simply put, we're actually never going to really love God with our heart unless we first understand the gospel, unless we first understand that he loved us first. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. There's a gentleman here by the name of, this is the gospel, so I just kind of shared that there. But there's a gentleman here. I was listening to him on a podcast. His name is Dr. Jack Deere. And Dr. Deere, very, faithful Christian over many years, right? Decades, okay? Look, he's like 70-something, 71 too. He's an author, megachurch pastor and then now a smaller church, and then he was even a seminary professor, right, out in Dallas. And so this young podcast host asked Dr. Deere, now that you're in your 70s, like 50 years ago when you first started your journey with Jesus, when you're in your 20s, what would you wish that you knew back then that you know today? And my thinking is, okay, let's learn from the wisdom of people who have gone before us so that we can learn it on the front end. Are you with me? And Dr. Deere said, I'll tell you the one thing I've learned in the 50 years of life with Jesus, ministry and failure and success and all the rest. He says, the one thing is, I think God wants me to know that he wants me not to endure him, but to enjoy him. He actually wants to be my friend. And now that sounds weird, right? Oh, God wants, either sounds too cliche or sounds like, no way, I can't believe that. But let's think about it. This has biblical justifications. In John chapter 15, Christ says that he no longer calls us servants, but he calls us friends. But what does that mean to be God's friend, right? I'll give you an example, how I've been trying to live this out in my own life. Like, what does it really mean? Because I want to love God with all my heart, but to do that, I got to figure out that the gospel is really, really true. So how do I do that? Lately, I've been trying to really take in, how do I enjoy God, not endure God? Enduring God is like, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. That's not what God is about. God is, I want you to enjoy this relationship with me, right? That's the gospel. Not that he saved us once back then. He saves us every day out of friendship with us. That's what he wants. Right? Let me just say, for some of you, I don't know if this might apply to some of you, but are you willing to enter into the relationship that God has called you to on his terms? And his terms being kindness and grace and forgiveness. He's forgiven you. Are you able to forgive yourselves? Right? So I think some of us need to hear that. I need to hear that. I need to get away from Bildad's false words and actually know that God is for us. That's the gospel. And if we're going to live a life of righteousness, it's only going to come because he first loved us. Are you with me? So that's the gospel. Let's get that into our hearts, right? I'll just share. At a recent barbecue, I was at my colleague's home, and I'll just call him Rob. This guy, Rob, was asked to pray for the meal, and there's like about 10 of us, 12 of us. And it just struck me. He's not a pastor or whatever. He was just a regular old Christian guy, and he prayed. But the way he opened the prayer really struck me, and then ended up sitting next to him over dinner, and we just chatted about that. But I said, I really appreciate the way you opened up your prayer. And he said, well, I was just being honest. And he said, God, we come to you with all our mess. That's it. I mean, we're at a barbecue, just hanging out, 4th of July, you know? But like, that's where he is with God. And he's also about 70. I love hanging out with 70-year-olds because there's so much wisdom to glean from them. And that's the first thing he said, because now he's got nothing to hide. He's been there long enough just to say, look, we're all messed up. And the sooner we can get that, not just once and for all, oh, God saved me from my sins, but on a daily basis, he saves us every day with the gospel. I said, Rob, I really appreciate those words. I'm gonna move then to the last point. I guess I will say this real quick. Back to Tim Keller. Speaking of 70-year-olds, I don't think he's quite 70, but one thing I appreciate about him is, again, I'm trying to learn things on the front end, you guys. I'm in my 40s, and I want to glean from the wisdom of those who walked before us, because life is hard, remember? Life is hard. So let me just take from every 60 or 70-year-old I can. But Tim Keller, just totally aside, okay, this is an aside, this is a whole other sermon, but he says, when people come to his pastor's office, when people come to his office and ask him, hey, how do I figure out God's will for my life? Am I supposed to do this or not? Do I take this job? Do I marry him or her? And so on and so forth. And they have all these questions about God's will. He says, I love it, right? He says, 99 times out of 100, I say to them, you have a brain. That's what he says. He says, you have a brain. By the way, Pastor Tim is loving. Okay, sounds kind of rude right there, but he goes, you have a brain. God gave it to you. You also have a community around you. They have wisdom. Make a decision. God will be faithful. And that's just so simple, right? Because most of the times you and I are like, oh, but what is it, God? And then you see a thing in the sky, or you're like, oh, it's that, right? Can I just tell you why I think we sometimes do that? Because we want to be so sure that it's from God that if anything goes wrong, you have someone else to blame and not yourself, right? But can we drink again from the gospel that says, I got you. I'm for you. Don't worry. Life will be hard, but I'll be with you. And everything I'm doing is for your good, Romans 8:28. Everything I'm doing is for your good. So don't fret and be so anxious. You do have a brain. He's given us wisdom and community and common sense. And so don't fret, because you're living like you don't belong to the king, right? And so I want to learn from that. And he also says that when we make decisions, I'm noticing this, by the way, when I make decisions lately, and they're big decisions sometimes, he says wisdom is different from technique. Open the Bible, get a word, and make a decision. Wisdom is not technique. Wisdom is, how he puts it, right foot, left foot. Right foot, left foot. For years, decades, and eventually the decision you make will come from a character that's formed, and it'll be the right decision. So wisdom isn't, oh, what's God's will right now? I need it by 5 o'clock. It's right foot, left foot for 5, 10, 20, 50 years. So I wanted to learn that. But let me just move to the last point then, which is loving our neighbor as ourselves, right?